It sounds simple enough. You collect old stuff, price it cheap, and sell it. People walk in, grab a lamp or a vintage denim jacket, hand you a few dollars, and everybody goes home happy. Low overhead, low pressure, feel good business. Maybe even a little charitable. What's not to like? But here's the thing, the moment you actually try to run one of these stores, you realize the gap between what a thrift store looks like from the outside and what it actually takes to survive on the inside is enormous. The margins are razor thin, the inventory is completely unpredictable, the labor costs are higher than most people expect, the competition has quietly become brutal. And the thrift industry, which for decades was left largely alone by the mainstream retail world, is now being squeezed from every direction simultaneously. This isn't a story about flipping old clothes for fun. This is a story about one of the most quietly complicated retail businesses in the world, what it actually costs to run one, how the money flows, why so many small thrift stores close within 3 years, and why the ones that succeed are doing something the rest of the industry hasn't figured out yet. Let's start at the beginning. The thrift store, as we know it, didn't really start as a business. It started as a social project. The Salvation Army opened its first thrift operations in the late 1800s. Goodwill followed in 1902. Founded by a Methodist minister named Edgar Helms, who collected donated goods from wealthy Boston neighborhoods and used the sorting and selling process as job training for immigrants and the poor. The idea was never really about retail. It was about creating dignified work and recycling resources for communities that had very little. For most of the 20th century, thrift stores existed in that middle space, part charity, part commerce, and almost nobody took them seriously as businesses in the traditional sense. They were quiet, slightly musty places where you went when you had to, not when you wanted to. That reputation stuck for decades. And then something shifted. By the 2000s, and accelerating sharply through the 2010s, thrifting started picking up cultural momentum. Environmental awareness played a role. So did the vintage fashion revival. So did the normalization of frugality after the 2008 financial crisis. So did platforms like Depop, Poshmark, and ThredUp, which turned reselling secondhand goods into something people could do from their phones. By the early 2020s, the secondhand clothing market alone was estimated to be worth around $43 billion globally, with projections suggesting it could double within a decade. Suddenly, what had been a non-profit niche was attracting for-profit operators, private equity interest, and serious entrepreneurial attention, which raises the real question. If you decided to open one today, what would that actually look like? Here's where it gets interesting. Most new thrift store owners don't fully understand their own cost structure until they're already in trouble. Let's walk through what it actually takes to open a small independent thrift store from scratch. Not a franchise, not a Goodwill, just a person who rents a storefront and starts selling donated or sourced secondhand goods. First, the space. Thrift stores need room. You can't run a credible thrift store in 500 square feet. You won't have enough category variety to bring people back. Most small operators aim for somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 square feet. In a mid-sized American city, commercial retail space in a workable but not prime location might rent for anywhere from $8 to $18 per square foot per year. So a 3,000 square foot store could cost you between $24,000 and $54,000 annually just in rent. And you want a location with foot traffic, visible signage, and parking, all of which push that number up. Then there's the build out. Racks, shelving, signage, point of sale systems, dressing rooms if you're selling clothing, lighting, security systems. A modest but functional build-out for a 3,000 square foot space might run between $15,000 and $40,000, depending on how much of the space is already usable. That's before you put a single item on the floor. Now comes the inventory question, and this is where thrift economics get genuinely unusual. Most retail businesses buy inventory at a predictable cost. A boutique clothing store pays a wholesale price, marks it up, and the math is relatively clean. But a thrift store that depends on donated goods has a different problem entirely. The cost of inventory isn't in the purchase price of the items. It's in the labor required to process them. Every single donation that comes through the door has to be evaluated. Is it sellable or is it garbage? Is the clothing clean, undamaged, free of odors? Is the furniture structurally sound? Is the electronics item actually functional? Somewhere between 20 and 40% of donations, depending on the store and the neighborhood, are simply not sellable and have to be disposed of. And disposal itself costs money. Hauling away unsellable goods often runs anywhere from a few hundred to several $1,000s per month at scale. Some stores negotiate relationships with textile recyclers who will take unusable clothing, occasionally for a small payment per pound, but that revenue rarely covers the full cost of what gets thrown away. The processing labor is where small operators get surprised. If you're sorting, cleaning, pricing, tagging, and staging incoming donations with a small staff, you're burning hours fast. A full-time employee at $15 to $18 per hour, which is increasingly the minimum in many states, costs you not just their wage, but payroll taxes and potentially benefits. A small thrift store with 4 or 5 part-time employees and 1 full-time manager might be spending $8,000 to $14,000 per month on labor alone. And that's before you've paid rent or utilities. So what does the revenue side look like? A small independent thrift store doing reasonably well might generate somewhere between $200,000 and $500,000 in annual gross revenue. That sounds like a wide range, but it reflects the reality of how variable foot traffic and donation volume can be. The best days in a thrift store are extraordinary. The worst days are genuinely bleak. The average transaction in a thrift store is low, typically somewhere between $8 and $20. That means to hit $300,000 in annual revenue, you need somewhere between 15,000 and 37,000 transactions per year. On a day-to-day basis, that's 40 to 100 paying customers on an average day. Some stores consistently clear that, others struggle to hit it 3 days a week. Gross margins in thrift retail are actually quite high in percentage terms, typically 60 to 80%, because the cost of goods is so low. But gross margin is almost a misleading number in this industry, because the real killer is operating expenses. Once you account for rent, labor, utilities, insurance, supplies, disposal costs, and the basic cost of running a payment and inventory system, many small operators find their net profit margin sitting somewhere between 5 and 15% on a good year and at 0 or below on a bad one. That means a store generating $300,000 per year in revenue might net somewhere between $15,000 and $45,000 in profit. That's the owner's return on what might have been $60,000 to $100,000 in startup capital and 60 hours of work per week. The math only makes sense if you're paying yourself a salary as the operator, you're growing, or you own the real estate. Now comes the part nobody talks about: the volunteer question. The reason Goodwill, the Salvation Army, Saint, Vincent de Paul, and most other major nonprofit thrift operators have a structural cost advantage over for-profit independents is not primarily because they get donated goods. It's because they supplement their paid labor with volunteers. A nonprofit thrift store with an active volunteer base can dramatically reduce its processing and floor labor costs, effectively subsidizing the business with unpaid work from community members who believe in the mission. A for-profit independent simply cannot replicate that structure. They pay every hour. This is not a minor difference. A store that replaces even 20 hours per week of paid labor with volunteer labor is saving somewhere between $15,000 and $20,000 per year. Over 5 years, that's the difference between surviving and not surviving. It also shapes how nonprofits can price. Because their cost structure is lower, they can afford to price items more aggressively. And because they're not trying to extract profit for shareholders, any surplus gets reinvested into operations or the mission. That makes them formidable competitors for any for-profit operator trying to undercut them on price. But here's where it gets interesting. Nonprofits have their own problems. Goodwill in particular has faced enormous public scrutiny over its executive compensation practices and its use of a legal provision that historically allowed it to pay workers with disabilities below minimum wage. Both issues generated significant negative press and, in some markets, damaged the brand's relationship with the very donors it depends on. Donations are not guaranteed. They are earned through trust. And in the social media era, a single viral story about a nonprofit's practices can dramatically suppress donation volume in a local market for months. The economics of thrift, in other words, are fragile on both sides of the for-profit and nonprofit divide. Let's talk about the inventory arms race, because this is something that's fundamentally changing the competitive landscape. For most of thrift retail's history, supply was abundant and demand was modest. Donations flowed in, stores priced things cheaply, and the ecosystem was stable. But starting around 2015 and accelerating sharply after 2020, something changed on the demand side. Resellers arrived. These are individuals and increasingly small businesses who walk through thrift stores specifically to identify underpriced high-value items, buy them, and flip them on eBay, Poshmark, Depop, Mercari, or their own Shopify stores for 2 to 10 times what they paid. The practice is completely legal. The economics are real. And for thrift stores, it's a double-edged sword. On one hand, resellers are paying customers. Every item a reseller buys is a sale the store made. On the other hand, resellers systematically remove the most valuable inventory, the vintage Levi's, the designer bags that got donated by accident, the rare collectibles before regular customers can find them. This hollows out the treasure hunt experience that drives casual shoppers into thrift stores in the first place. Smarter thrift operators have responded by doing something previously unthinkable in this industry: deliberate pricing. Instead of pricing everything by category at a flat rate, they're now actively researching items before they hit the floor. That $4 flannel shirt stays $4, but the vintage Pendleton wool coat that eBay shows selling for $120, that gets priced at $55 or $75 and goes on a featured rack. Some stores have created dedicated boutique sections with higher-end pricing for premium donations. This is smart business. But it also changes what a thrift store is. The moment you start actively curating and competitively pricing premium items, you're moving away from the flat-rate donation model and towards something that looks more like a consignment shop or vintage boutique. Which means more labor. More expertise. More time researching eBay sold listings before you tag something and put it on the floor. And more expectation management with customers who came in hoping to find a $3 blazer. There's also the e-commerce question, and it's reshaping the economics of the entire industry. Goodwill's online auction platform, shopgoodwill.com, has become a genuinely significant revenue channel. Some individual Goodwill operations run dedicated processing centers just for online inventory, where items are photographed, described, listed, and shipped, essentially running a parallel e-commerce operation alongside the physical store. It's expensive to build and operate, but the upside is that a rare item no longer has to be priced for the local market. It can be listed nationally or internationally and sell for multiples of what the floor price would have been. For smaller independent operators, this same logic applies, but the barrier to entry is significant. Photographing, listing, managing auctions, packing, shipping, and handling customer service for individual secondhand items is intensely labor-intensive. It can work well for high-value goods, vintage electronics, collectibles, rare books. Antique jewelry, but it's economically impossible to do with low-value clothing at scale unless you've built specialized infrastructure. The stores that are threading this needle most effectively tend to be hybrids. They run a physical floor for volume and foot traffic. They run a curated online channel for their highest value items. And they've structured their processing operation to quickly identify which bucket each donated item belongs in. Getting that routing right and doing it consistently with whatever staff you have is harder than it sounds. Now let's look at what happens when things go wrong, because in this business they often do. Donation volume is completely outside your control. If your store is in a neighborhood undergoing demographic transition, if a competitor opens nearby, or if a major donation channel dries up, say, a church that used to send you weekly loads stops doing so, your inventory can fall off dramatically with almost no warning. Unlike a traditional retailer who can call a supplier and reorder stock, a thrift store operator has to go out and create new donation pipelines. That means marketing, community relationships, pickup services, and time. Pickup services are worth a separate mention. Many thrift stores offer free donation pickup, where a truck goes to donors' homes and collects furniture, boxes of clothing, or whatever they have. This is a significant marketing and supply tool. But running a pickup operation means owning or leasing a truck, typically a box truck, in the $35,000 to $60,000 range new, or something older and cheaper, but with more maintenance risk, plus fuel, insurance, and driver costs. It's an investment that can pay for itself if the donations it generates are high quality and high volume. But it's another layer of operational complexity. Theft is another issue the industry rarely discusses publicly, but privately acknowledges is substantial. Thrift stores, by design, have enormous amounts of loosely organized merchandise, minimal packaging, and customers who are often browsing casually through racks and shelves. Shrink the retail term for inventory lost to theft runs at about 5 to 2% in traditional retail on average, but in thrift stores, many operators privately estimate it runs higher, particularly in clothing and small goods. When you're already working with thin margins, losing even 2 to 3% of revenue to theft is painful. And then there's the regulatory environment. Thrift stores are retail businesses subject to the full range of business regulations, zoning laws, ADA accessibility requirements, fire codes, sales tax collection, employment law compliance, and increasingly environmental regulations around the disposal of certain donated goods. Older electronics, CRTs, fluorescent bulbs, and certain household chemicals cannot simply be thrown in the trash. Proper disposal costs money. Small operators who don't know this learn it the hard way when they get fined. So why does anyone do this? The honest answer is that for many operators, it's not primarily a financial calculation. There's a genuine mission component keeping goods out of landfills, providing affordable goods to low-income communities, creating local employment, and building a neighborhood institution. Those motivations are real, and they sustain operators through years where the net profit barely covers the owner's salary. But there are also successful for-profit models that work, and they tend to share a few specific traits. The most successful independent thrift operators tend to own or have extremely favorable long-term leases on their real estate. Eliminating or dramatically reducing rent transforms the economics. A store doing $350,000 in annual revenue that's paying $50,000 in rent nets very differently from one that owns its building outright. Over a decade, that gap compounds enormously. They also tend to have dominant positioning in their local donation market. If you're the store in your area that has the best pickup service, the most visible donation drop-off, the strongest community reputation, and relationships with local estate sale companies and church networks, you've built a supply moat that's genuinely hard for a competitor to replicate quickly. And the best operators tend to run extremely lean organizations. They know exactly what their labor hours are generating in revenue per hour. They track inventory turnover aggressively. They know which categories are moving and which are sitting, and they mark down or rotate unsold goods on a consistent schedule rather than letting them accumulate. In thrift retail, stale inventory is death. If the store starts to feel like a junk pile rather than a treasure hunt, customers stop coming, and donation volume eventually follows. The broader industry is moving in a direction that will likely make all of this harder for small operators over the next decade. Online resale platforms are continuing to grow. ThredUp, which operates as an online consignment and thrift store, now processes tens of millions of items per year and has built warehouse infrastructure and AI-powered sorting technology that no independent store can match. Poshmark, Depop, and Vestiaire Collective are attracting an increasingly sophisticated seller base. The premium end of the secondhand market is migrating online, which means the best inventory, the stuff that generates the margins, is being competed for more aggressively than ever before. Meanwhile, fast fashion is creating a paradox. More clothing is being produced and donated than ever before, but much of it is low quality and genuinely not resellable. The volume of textile donations is rising, but the quality and value per item is declining. Some stores are drowning in unusable fast fashion donations that cost money to dispose of, while simultaneously struggling to find enough high-quality goods to fill their floor with things people actually want to buy. And in some major urban markets, the concept of thrift is being gentrified in real time. Stores that once served low-income communities are now attracting wealthier vintage hunters and resellers who are willing to pay more, which raises prices, which prices out the original customer base. It's a genuine ethical tension, not just an economic one. What the industry looks like in 10 years probably depends on which part of the market you're in. The big nonprofit operators, Goodwill, Salvation Army, St. Vincent de Paul, have scale, brand recognition, and cost structures that will allow them to survive almost any market shift. They also have the infrastructure to build serious e-commerce channels, and several are already doing so. The successful mid-size independents, the ones with owned real estate, strong community ties, and smart operational discipline will likely find a stable niche. They'll be smaller, more curated, and more intentional than the big operators, and that differentiation will attract a loyal customer base. The ones at risk are the undercapitalized new entrants who open a thrift store because it seems simple and low risk, without fully understanding what they're walking into. The inventory problem, the labor math, the nonprofit competition, and the reseller disruption are enough to sink a business that isn't prepared for all of them simultaneously. Thrift retail is not a get-rich business. It never was. But it's a genuinely fascinating one because it sits at the intersection of consumer behavior, environmental economics, community infrastructure, and the deeply human impulse to see value in things that other people have discarded. The stores that last aren't just selling old stuff. They're building something the community decides it can't do without. And in a retail environment where even massive, well-capitalized brands are shutting down stores by the hundreds, that kind of embedded local value might be worth more than any single quarterly margin ever could.